I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Mark Schaller. He is a professor of psychology at the University of British Columbia, where he studies social cognition from an evolutionary perspective. Mark, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Great to have you here. So, Mark, I first came across your work when I was reading about the behavioral immune system. And if I understand it correctly, the idea is that in addition to our regular immune system with the white blood cells fighting off bacteria and whatnot, we also have these behavioral adaptations. So like we might feel disgusted at a bad smell and then we'll avoid that whatever rotting food or whatever is, because maybe it's housing bacteria. So in addition to once the bacteria gets in our body and we avoid it or we fight it off, we'll also avoid potential places that might have these bad bacteria.
That's right. I mean, and an analogy that appeals to me is, the immune system that we're all familiar with, all the stuff that fights off these infections when they get inside us. It's kind of like medical insurance. It's great to have an immune system, but it really stinks when you have to use it. I mean,
Right.
It's deeply unpleasant. It, consumes all these resources. It's just way better not to get sick in the first place, and that's where the behavioral immune system comes into play. It helps us avoid the things that make us sick.
Yeah, that is a great analogy, because it's like our body does have the ability to heal cuts and heal even broken bones, but it's like you don't want to go off breaking your bones. You want to avoid that whenever you can.
I mean, I'm a dunce about actual immunology, but I do know that that when we get sick and the immune system has to kick in to fight off all these pathogens that get inside us, it's enormously costly in terms of metabolic resources and things. It's debilitating and so forth. So I think that's useful to keep in mind when understanding why these additional mechanisms, these kind of psychological mechanisms, evolved. Because things don't just evolve for free. I mean, there has to be a benefit that outweighs those costs, and in this case, there's a pretty enormous benefit to avoid the things that make us sick.
Yeah, when you think about it, it really makes sense. But it sounds like this is somewhat of a new line of research, at least if you compare it to how long we've been doing psychology and how long we've been doing immunology.
I think the basic ideas have been around for a long time, and certainly folks who are biologists, behavioral ecologists have done various lines of work that focus on how all kinds of animals, including but not limited to humans, engage in behaviors that complement the immunological defenses against diseases. And within psychology, people have been doing work on disgust for a very long time. I think that one reason why maybe this line of work wasn't bigger within the psychological sciences until just the last 20 years or so, or less, is that I think people underestimate just the enormous power that pathogens imposed on our evolution over the course of the many millions of years. And I think scientists tend to be pretty attentive to things that matter in the here and now, and certainly a lot of psychologists, most psychologists have historically lived in a relatively modern environment where horrific diseases aren't in our face all the time. And it's really easy to underestimate just how truly powerful a selective force they imposed on our ancestors.
Right. When we think of threats to our ancestors, this heuristic comes to mind of like maybe they're being chased by lions out in the savannah, but in reality, probably countless numbers of them have died just due to disease and not having proper medical care.
I mean, I know this kind of thing is difficult to estimate, and I'm taking other people's word for it, but I remember reading once a summary statistic that was something like this, that infectious diseases have, over the course of human history, have killed more people than all other causes of death put together.
Yeah.
And
That makes sense. I wouldn't be surprised. So did you start more as a traditional social psychologist and then you transitioned more towards this biological end?
yeah, I mean, my training is as an experimental social psychologist, and most of the work that I've done, including the work I've done on the behavioral immune system, fits within that framework for the most part. Studying how people think and interact with other people, and it, I mean, I've brought for some time in my research kind of I've drawn upon, let's say, the logical tools of evolutionary biology to try to inform my thinking about the way the human mind works and to inform hypotheses that seem worth testing. But I kind of fell into the work on the behavioral immune system through this kind of side door. I hadn't been doing any work on disease, and like I said a little while ago, I mean, I'm mostly a dunce about this stuff. I don't know anything about disease. But I'd been doing work on stereotypes and prejudices and some of the psychological bases of the stereotypes that people form and the prejudices that we have against folks. I'd been doing some work on threats and on how when people perceive that somebody poses a kind of a threat, that has particular kind of implications for prejudice. And none of that had been focused on the threat of disease, but it was within that context that I started thinking about some of these threats that at least, within the psychological sciences, people hadn't been talking about and were mostly invisible, or at least were underrated. And that kind of led me to actually think a little bit more deeply about the history of disease and our ancestors' interactions with pathogens in the environment, and some of the implications it might have for specific kinds of stereotypes and prejudices we have about specific groups of people. And one thing led to another. I started taking some of these ideas and pushing it in other directions as well. They went well beyond the implications for prejudice.
So I've heard some evolutionary theories about prejudice and like in-group, out-group bias, and the idea is that maybe in our evolutionary past we lived in these tribes, so it makes sense to be biased towards people in your own tribe, and then maybe consider outsiders as threats. Now, and then other people could maybe easily argue as something like that's just evolutionary armchair thinking as an excuse for prejudice, which isn't good. So what's the scientific consensus on that issue, if there is one?
Well, first of all, I think that one has to be very, very cautious about this kind of armchair thinking, because there's a lot of crappy science of various kinds, and there's certainly a lot of crappy, not very well thought through applications of evolutionary ideas to the cognitive and social sciences. And we know that this kind of thing is easily misunderstood. So you brought up a kind of an easy misunderstanding that people often take, which is, if one makes an argument or provides evidence that suggests, oh, maybe there's an evolutionary basis for this, this bad thing, prejudice, that people fall into this illogical trap of viewing it, the naturalistic fallacy. If there's a natural basis for it, then it's okay. Well, the first part of that thing, maybe there's a natural basis for it, that falls in the realm of science. The second part of that, well, it's, this idea of making a value judgment about whether it's okay or not, that ain't science at all, right? I mean, that's
more of an ethical question.
And so, so it's something that I'm very wary of, because people do often, make value judgments about whether something is good or bad on the basis of whether, there's a biological basis for it or not. So I think the scientific consensus, getting back to your question, would be scientists do science. Scientists don't make value judgments about whether the results are good or bad. That
Right.
that kind of thing lies in the realm of moral philosophy.
Uh-huh.
Nevertheless, it's inevitably we as scientists need to take some care in how we communicate these ideas, and certainly the kind of work that I and a lot of other folks who've done work on the behavioral immune system has done is it's actually focused not just on the simple question of, hey, maybe is there does this provide a window into why people are prejudiced at all? That's a very simple question. I think a more interesting and a more useful question is, what are the implications of this line of work for understanding the conditions under which people might be more or less prejudiced, or more or less of something else that is implicated by the behavioral immune system. And one of the tools that, and again, this comes from an evolutionary approach, one of the tools that I found useful is this notion that that people respond very flexibly to other people, including other people who might be perceived to pose a threat, such as the threat of disease. They respond differently under different circumstances, depending upon the implied costs and benefits of how they might respond. So most of my work is focused on trying to identify what the implications are for understanding how the behavioral immune system might be especially highly activated under some circumstances, not so much under other circumstances, which then has consequences for whether people are more or less prejudiced against certain kinds of people or not, implications for whether people are more likely to conform to majority opinion, and
So how do you untangle whether these behaviors are biologically evolved or more like socially evolved? Because a classic example of this is language. You could either believe that we have an innate biological capacity for learning language, or you can say something like, it all has to do with culture. And once you take that away, you might have no language.
Yeah, I mean, luckily, I'm not a historian, and I'm not actually trying to understand exactly how these things emerged over many millennia. I am focused on what is, I think, the the easier task of saying what are the implications right here and right now. But I'll try to give at least a very short answer to your question anyway, even though that's not my expertise. And I apologize in advance if the answer comes across as sounding too glib, but the answer that appeals to me anyway is something like this. It's almost always both. That is,
yeah.
Anybody, I mean, given the name of your podcast, I assume are very familiar with this, but there's a tendency for when people are talking about nature and nurture to talk about them as somehow they're different and entirely separable things, and they put like a versus in the middle, nature versus nurture, and all these sorts of things that are, of course, are kind of silly, right? And so all the nurture kinds of elements that you alluded to, of course, have a biological basis. Our capacity for language, our capacity to learn, our capacity to pass on cultural norms to future generations, and so forth. All of those capacities have a deep biological basis, and we know that, of course, the stuff that the deep stuff that matters when one's talking about evolutionary processes, genetic transmission, genetic mechanisms, none of these things actually directly affect human cognition and behavior. Their effects on human cognition and behavior are based upon how they build bodies, how those bodies develop, how those bodies actually learn from the environments within which they develop. So anyway, these things are all entirely intertwined. And so given how hugely intertwined they are, I guess my inclination is not to try to disentangle them in any kind of meaningful way, but to kind of recognize that there is this, that all these kind of psychological things that my students and I study, they may have this biological basis to them, but that doesn't in any way undersell the importance of development and the socio-cultural context in which people develop.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest recurring themes from this podcast is how intertwined they are, and how the answer is always, well, they both play a role. So you mentioned that the goal of your work is to understand behavior in specific contexts and then see what we can do about that. So it sounds much more practical. And I've heard about these somewhat new tests, like for implicit bias and things like that, and training in one direction or the other. So do those work? Because in order for them to work, that would seem to be more on the nurture side, I guess, because otherwise, if people have different biological dispositions for things like bias, that seems like it would be a much harder problem to fix.
I'm not exactly sure I follow your question.
Okay, so if certain people have biases and people have different levels of bias, and some people have proposed these sort of trainings to limit people's bias. Are those programs successful from an academic sense?
Yeah, my sense, and I'm not an expert on these training programs designed to, let's say, undermine people's implicit bias. My sense is that there's a lot of work on it, and the work suggests that they kind of are and they kind of aren't. So that is, and I've never done any work on training programs designed to try to in some way truly change people's biases or prejudices. What I have done is, I've used those kinds of measures that get at the kind of the automatic activation of a particular attitude, or the automatic activation in somebody's mind of a particular prejudice. I've done work that uses those kind of measures. And in the context in which I've done my work, I've looked at how those implicit biases are highly malleable. Maybe not in my work, not in response to training programs, but just in response to the particular situations that people are in. So, for example, relating it back to the behavioral immune system, I and other people have done work in which we look at how people respond differently depending upon whether they themselves temporarily feel vulnerable to infection or not. And one of the implications from this line of work is that in circumstances when people personally feel, hey, I feel kind of vulnerable, it's a diseasey environment out there, that some of these, let's say a xenophobic response to foreigners tends to spring more readily to mind. But when people feel less vulnerable, then they spring less readily to mind. And I think, one can look at that in kind of a pessimistic way, or you can look at it in an optimistic way. So the pessimistic way is something like this. It's like, wow, that's a drag, it's we're learning how to make people more prejudiced. And, if you do something that makes people freaked out about their vulnerability to disease, they'll be more prejudiced. But the optimistic frame is that one can do things to structure the environments that people live in and so forth, such that people feel less vulnerable to disease, even in the context, say, of a global pandemic.
Right.
People can feel more reassured that if they get sick, there's good medical care available to them. and so forth, that can reduce people's sense of vulnerability. And in turn, the research shows that can make people, that can lead people to respond in a less prejudiced way against people who they might otherwise be prejudiced against.
Mm-hmm. So this pandemic could be like a global experiment to test this hypothesis, because so the theory would be that during the pandemic, we would see prejudice go up because people are feeling more vulnerable.
That's right. And there is, I mean, I'm when this pandemic hit hard around the world a year and a half ago, there were, I know dozens, hundreds of people who sprang into action to, in one way or another, take advantage of this natural experiment. I resisted that temptation because, hey, I got other things going on, and it turns out I don't need to do what hundreds of other people are doing. But I have been attentive to, the results of some of the studies that people have done in this period of time that are testing exactly that question. There is some work that has shown that there does seem to be, at least in some countries, some implications for certain prejudices. There hasn't been a lot of that. I mean, one of the things that I've seen more ties into a big topic in the area of the behavioral immune system that doesn't focus on prejudice, but focuses on other kinds of attitudes and other kinds of responses that people have. Would you like me to tell you a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely.
It's kind of neat. I got to give you a little bit of backstory though.
Sure.
So cut me off if I start babbling too long, this ties into people's tendency to conform and to make and to endorse traditional norms and things like that. So the conceptual backstory ties into some of the work on prejudice. So I'll start there. So I mean, there has been work that shows that when the behavioral immune system is more readily activated, that people respond more negatively toward foreigners, people who they perceive to be, just different in some way. And it turns out there's some research that suggests that one of the reasons for that is because it's not simply because they perceive foreigners to be carriers of exotic diseases or something like that. It seems that it may be due more strongly to this notion that foreigners, people who are different from me, act different. They have different norms, and if they're amongst us, then they're going to violate the kinds of norms that we have. Now, the question that you might ask is, well, how does that relate to the spread of disease? And the answer is that, a lot of the norms that develop within cultures and societies serve as a kind of a buffer against the spread of disease. We prepare food in a certain way. We have certain norms of personal hygiene. We have certain norms of appropriate close physical contact and so forth. And so an argument that anthropologists have made is that a lot of the norms that govern human behavior actually serve as kind of buffers against the spread of disease. So consequently, anybody who violates those norms is posing a kind of a disease threat.
Mm-hmm. I've even heard some theories about religion having evolved for that purpose. Now that I don't know if that's just another example of sort of armchair theorizing, but religions have typically constraints on sex and the way you eat food, maybe even the way you dress and clean yourself, like all of these things that you kind of just mentioned.
Right. So I can't comment on that because I am very much not a historian of religion, but it rings true. It jives with this other work that anthropologists have done, which then brings us back to this whole other package, this whole other suite of attitudinal and behavioral responses that are associated with the behavioral immune system. And so there's a lot of work that shows that, under conditions in which people are more freaked out by disease, they're more likely to make harsh judgments about people who violate norms. They're more likely to be more conformist themselves, to more likely to go along with majority opinion. There's a line of work that links this to political conservatism, because conservatism compared to liberalism is essentially defined by kind of an affection for keeping things the way they are and being, distrustful of progressive new ways of doing things. So anyway, this brings me back around to your question about the global, the global experiment that this pandemic has created. And there is, I've seen several published articles just very recently that have actually shown that comparing pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, there have been changes in, well, for example, I'm babbling. I'll start the sentence again. There have been studies in multiple countries, including one in Poland that I saw, one in the US, that showed that the onset of the pandemic was associated with an increased tendency to endorse, say, traditional gender norms and a greater distrust of people who violated certain gender norms or norms of sexual behavior and so forth. So so that too is consistent with this experimental work done in people's labs on the effects of disease threat on things like conformity and more socially conservative attitudes. And there is this evidence that that's happened at a more population level as a result of the COVID pandemic.
So under threat, people tend to become more conservative because the idea is like, well, this didn't kill me in the past, so maybe it's a safer alternative.
I think that's kind of the idea that, I mean, of course, people aren't actually thinking about this in any kind of conscious way, but the idea that people do trust things that are familiar to them, and people, lots of human beings are also willing to try new stuff, but when people feel more vulnerable to threat, they seem to kind of lean more toward, let's just stick with the old stuff and not do new stuff. And at least experimental research that is carefully try to disentangle this kind of thing has shown that while this tends to happen in response to any kind of threat, it seems to be especially potent and especially strong in response to disease threat.
Do you know of any research showing whether this is so I can imagine two competing hypotheses. One would be something like it's an automatic response to just your environment. So it's like you see threat and you instantly modify your behavior. And then the other one might be something like you see threat and then it has to invoke a certain emotional reaction. And then that emotion might be what influences the behavior.
Yeah, it's a really good question. The question about what is the role of emotion in this sort of thing. And I think it's an especially pertinent question when talking about the behavioral immune system, because a particular emotion, disgust, is very closely aligned with the behavioral immune system. In fact, these kinds of mechanisms that we can apply to nickname behavioral immune system to, other people have called it simply the disgust system. So the question is the, and I think your question really is the arousal of disgust, the experience of disgust, necessary in order to kind of lead to these kinds of responses that we've been talking about?
Exactly. So I guess you could imagine someone who was had very low sensitivity to, or no, very, very high sensitivity to disgust, and then they might be shielded by these sort of behavioral adaptations.
Right. And I think that the arousal of disgust clearly seems to be associated with some of these kinds of responses. If I see somebody who violates some treasured cultural norm, that may kind of elicit some sense of disgust. It might not feel to me like the kind of disgust that I would experience if, I don't know, somebody just smushed a pile of poop in my hand, but it would be kind of linked to it in some way. It would feel I'm disgusted, I'm offended by this thing. It doesn't seem as though the actual experience of disgust accounts for, or at least isn't the arousal of disgust doesn't seem necessary to account for all of the findings that people have shown in all the studies. So, for example, one of the lines of work, and my students and I have done some of this, shows that when people feel more vulnerable to disease, they're more likely to conform to majority opinion. And it doesn't seem that there's much arousal of disgust there, because people aren't actually responding to a violation of some sort. They're simply like making decisions about whether to go along with the crowd. I suspect that that disgust played some sort of, let's say, developmental role there. So that is and this is kind of a place where learning comes into play, that people over the course of their lifetime learn that non-conformity is less valued than conformity, let's say, because I failed to conform to some treasured norm, people chide me, that sort of thing. I see other people failing to conform with some norm, maybe that kind of arouses disgust. I don't want to be the kind of person who arouses disgust in others. So there's disgust can have a power, like a lot of emotions, can have a powerful effect on the learning process. And as a consequence of the effect on the learning process, that may in the future incline people to be more conformist in general, and more conformist, especially when they themselves perceive that that there's diseases around, or if for some other reason they feel vulnerable to disease. It's a complicated topic, and I realize that's kind of a weird, long-winded, convoluted answer. But the short answer is disgust matters, but it doesn't seem to necessarily be involved at the moment in accounting for some of the effects that are associated with the behavioral immune system.
And then even some of the other effects that you mentioned, like threat, is that more of an emotional feeling threatened, or is it more of like you're kind of calculating these risks and then adapting your behavior as a result of that calculation?
I'm going to get hung up on just the concept of calculating, which at one level makes it sound as though people are approaching the stuff in a rational way. I don't think that's what you meant, but I think most of the work on the behavioral immune system tends to assume that it's not particularly rational. It's not one of these kind of slowly calculating sets of psychological processes. It really is people responding in kind of quick and dirty, highly automatized way to the environments they perceive around them. Now, we can probably do some sort of, let's say, quick and dirty cost benefit analyses that we're not even kind of consciously aware of. And so I suspect that's what's going on. Really, what's going on with the behavioral immune system for a lot of the phenomena is that people are really responding kind of in a highly automatized way to simple cues that they perceive. I perceive, a person who looks or acts differently, or I perceive some behavior that violates the norms that I hold dear. And I'm kind of responding in kind of a quick and automatic way to that thing, not necessarily thinking it through in any rational way.
So it's kind of the automatic result of a lifetime of social learning and conditioning.
Yeah, that's right. And people have done some work. I mean, this definitely is not my area of expertise. People have done some work on the learning process, and that seems to suggest that, of course, people that there is, let's say, a biological preparedness to learn some things faster than others.
Hmm.
And
So
so
what
that's another
happens?
example of how, the biological underpinnings and the learning part of it kind of intersect.
So what happens in an experimental setting if you try and flip the traditional associations that people are making? So for example, you offer a reward if someone interacts with maybe a sick person or something that they might find disgusting, as opposed to what they're predisposed to normally avoid it. And then they would avoid maybe the healthier, more attractive thing. Do you know of any research doing something like that?
I don't know off the top of my head. I don't know of anything that does exactly that. Of course, I mean, you're bringing up kind of a great example of two quite different psychological processes that through or mechanisms that they can operate in parallel. One drives somebody towards somebody because of the reward that you've offered. The other kind of makes people pull away because of this lifetime of learning.
So it's like which one becomes stronger in that moment?
Yeah, and I mean, my prediction, and this is, I think, a very simple-minded prediction that won't surprise you in any way, is that which of those two which of those two mechanisms is going to win? Well, it's going to depend.
Yeah.
How big is the reward? Is it big enough to outweigh the cost that I might otherwise perceive? But I think, I mean, one of the it's a nice example too of how these kind of mechanisms are. I mean, they are highly malleable. They're more likely to be turned on in some contexts than others. And I mean, here's an example of a line of work that is kind of analogous to the thing that you pitched, but it has less to do with, offering people some reward, and more has to do with just kind of the natural interplay between different kinds of motives. So on the one hand, you've got the behavioral immune system, which is essentially a nickname for this disease avoidant motivational system. And that leads me to, potentially want to avoid folks who, for some reason, look or act like they might pose some sort of disease threat. That can come into conflict with another very powerful motivational system, which is the system that governs affiliation. If I'm feeling lonely and deprived of social connection, that kind of inclines me to actually reach out to people. And people have done research that looks at kind of the tug of war between these affiliative responses and these disease avoidant responses. And it is very clear that, if somebody has this more powerful need for affiliation, then that can override some of the effects of the behavioral immune system, and vice versa.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So how about the behavioral immune system in children? Because one thing I'm thinking is that you might see, because children are more vulnerable, they would tend to be more avoidant of things that could potentially be dangerous. But conversely, you see that like children love getting dirty and like doing all these things that their parents would want to pull them away from.
Yeah, there's not enough research on the developmental aspects of the behavioral immune system. I mean, there is some. I'm not a developmental psychologist, so I won't claim to be a great expert on this. But I'll mention a couple of things that I think are relevant here, both of which tie into some of the themes that we've already been talking about. One of them is the topic of learning. So that is, we are not born, nor are we conceived with a fully developed sense of what actually poses a threat of disease. These are things that, what we probably are conceived with and born with is an ability to quickly learn what those things are. But of course, it depends on learning, and there's a lot of work that does show that kids are pretty attentive to, say, the emotional expressions of other folks, because those emotional expressions, like a disgust expression, give me information about what are the things I should avoid and not avoid. But again, that takes a certain amount of time. It takes a while to learn that stuff. So that's going to have implications for, well, for when people actually, are old enough to start avoiding these kind of things. Another thing that matters, I think, is the fact that, well, human beings are famously slow developers compared to most other mammals. We develop really late, right? It's like some animals may reach sexual maturity after a few months. For us, it takes years and years and years. And during the first, year or two, or even more of our lives, we're pretty darn helpless, which means that we don't really have to look out for ourselves, because there's some parent, some caretaker who's actually doing the looking out for us. And it seems like it's not until infants become mobile and able to kind of move around and have the motor control to do things themselves that their tendency to be disgusted by things shows up. Infants aren't disgusted by anything. You squish a pile of poop in a 1-month-old baby's hands, and it'll smear that all over itself.
Yeah.
But by the time that kid is 2 years old and more mobile, they seem to have the facility to develop a disgust response to that sort of thing.
Right. It's very interesting how there's this disgust in this psychological sense we've been talking about, more of like a social learning thing. And then there's another form of disgust. A couple months ago, I was speaking with a biological anthropologist, and he studies the evolution of substance use. And one of the things we talked about is how adults tend to gravitate towards these, like, well, obviously there's things like drugs and nicotine and these addictive substances, but there's also like dark chocolate and coffee and all these bitter flavors that adults kind of like, but children hate. And his one of the things he said was that children are disgusted by these things because they're more vulnerable when they're young, and then sort of your gut gets stronger as you get older, and you're more okay with like bitter flavors. So in that sense, when you're dealing with not like ideas, but with actual things and senses and taste, it seems like children have a stronger disgust response.
Yeah, it's and in this case, right, we're talking about distaste response, which is something, again, this is not my expertise, but people who have tried to understand the evolution of disgust do suggest that or at least some of these folks suggest that it's kind of the broader disgust response evolved from the more focal distaste response to actually things that are in our mouth. And it does seem, I'll take you and your biological anthropologist friend's word for it, that infants develop a distaste response to
maybe not infants, but
palatable
definitely
food.
children. Yeah. And then you start, I definitely noticed it with myself. I definitely didn't like dark chocolate when I was younger, and now I prefer it.
Yeah, I also think, and again, we're getting well beyond anything that I could have any real expertise on. So for anybody who's listening, bear in mind, I'm a dunce about the kind of topic I'm about to get into. I suspect there is, with some of these bitter tastes, these tanniny things and so forth, that adults too kind of learn to accept those tastes. That is, I could be 30 years old and never have tasted coffee before or beer before, and the first time you put it in my mouth, I would probably find it very unpleasant for exactly the reasons that you talked about. Uh,
So
but
even with that, there's like a social component.
yeah, I mean, right. I mean, people learn to like coffee because there's benefits to being a coffee drinker if you're around a bunch of other people who are drinking coffee, and or if you like the the buzz that the caffeine gives you, there's the benefits, analogous benefits, if you want to call them that,
Yeah.
associated with being a beer drinker and whatnot. So even even grown-ups will go through that learning process, and as people who are experts on distaste and disgust have argued, with enough exposure, you can learn to like anything.
Hmm. So I've dragged you along on a lot of these interesting tangential ideas, but I think for our last 15 minutes or so, we should dial it back to what you're actually working on now, or your plans for future research.
Well, honestly, the stuff that I'm working on now has very little to do with the behavioral immune system. So I'm not sure if you want to go there or not, because
Yeah, definitely. Let's go there and make this conversation more well-rounded.
okay. Well, I'll tell you about one thing that I am working on that has certain, let's say, analogies to the work that I had been doing on the behavioral immune system. And so the big picture was this. One of the things that attracted me to this work on disease and its implications for human psychology was the fact that people weren't doing this kind of thing. When people talk about, that is when psychological scientists talk about, let's say, the motives that matter. They talk about, I don't know, mating motives. There's tons of work on that. And, affiliation motives. There's tons of work on that. And yes, avoiding harm, that type of thing. But people weren't talking about the kind of the more specific kinds of problems that are posed by disease. So one of the things that I found very interesting and kind of drew me into it was that it seemed like it was a really important topic that had been overlooked for one reason or another. Anyway, so I did some work on the behavioral immune system for a few years, and I still dabble and I pay attention to it, but it's not my primary area anymore. I get bored easily by whatever I'm doing. I want to move on. And so one of the things that I cast about thinking about is what other kind of motivational systems that really matter might have been largely overlooked in the psychological sciences, and particularly if these motivational systems have some sort of non-obvious implications. Long story short, I got interested in a different motivational system. It doesn't have a cute nickname like the behavioral immune system, but it's the motivational system that governs parental caregiving. So the idea here is that psychologists have, for decades and decades, done lots of research on parenting. The idea being, it's like, what makes somebody a good parent to their kids, that sort of thing, and what are the implications of different parenting styles on their kids' outcomes. Mm-hmm. What I got kind of interested in was elements of parental caregiving that have nothing to do with parents and their own children, but that go beyond that. And the idea is that people, if you have a kid, if you become a mom or a dad, you don't just become instantly magically endowed with some sort of caregiving psychology. The underlying psychology that governs parental caregiving is presumably part of our natural architecture, just like the underlying mechanisms that govern the avoidance of disease. But they just they come online more when people are in a situation where suddenly they're thrust with caring for a kid. Anyway, what I got interested in was just the kind of the role of the underlying psychological architecture of parental caregiving, even among people who aren't parents and might never be parents, might even be children themselves. And so along with my students, we developed a line of work just looking at how the psychology of parental caregiving can have a variety of interesting implications, some of which may be non-obvious. And, you know, we've looked at implications for moral judgments. Other people have actually found that it has implications for intergroup prejudice. There's implications for political attitudes and so forth. So that's, it's a line of work that was kind of inspired in kind of a distal way by the work that I had been involved in on the behavioral immune system. It just takes it in a very different direction and looking at why the psychology of parental care matters, even if you're not actually interested in parents taking care of children.
I've heard of some research on the neurochemistry behind this, like oxytocin being like a bonding chemical between people, but I'm guessing that's probably not what you're doing. Your work is probably more social and behavioral.
Yeah, I've been looking more at kind of the cognitive and behavioral implications. I'm not I don't trust myself to be a good neuroscientist, so I haven't been looking at the hormonal aspects of it. But there are people who are, and anyway. But one of the things that I find interesting about it is that there's this. Well, I guess this governs a lot of the work that I tended to do anyway, is just looking at the non-obvious implications that accompany the more obvious things that people have studied.
So is this something that will change either over time or with context, or is it more like a personality marker? Maybe it's like some people are more agreeable and might make for better caring parents.
Well, one of the certainly one of the things that we've done just as kind of a research strategy is looking at these differences between people, and we developed a questionnaire that taps into different aspects of parental caregiving, including kind of a nurturing kind of inclination, as well as a protecting from harm, somebody else from harm inclination. And people do vary a lot on this sort of thing, which has these additional consequences. So, for example, people who are more dispositionally inclined toward caring for children, again, whether they are themselves parents or not, these people who are more dispositionally inclined toward caring for children make harsher judgments about adults who violate social norms. It's kind of an example of, hey, I don't like this person who violates norms. They pose a threat not just to myself but to kids, and so I don't want them around.
That makes sense. So if you don't have those strong beliefs yourself, you also wouldn't be bothered as much if someone else is like not as caring or.
That's right. Now there's a nuance there that if it's a child who violates norms, the people who are more parental in their dispositions actually are less harsh in judging that child. They're more understanding and accepting of it. Anyway, so I just kind of bring that up as an example to illustrate the point that, yeah, people, for whatever reason, whether there's kind of a genetic basis or because of the way they were raised and socialized or whatever, people differ a lot in these inclinations, which have these further implications, many of which don't have anything to do with, not, or at least not directly to do with providing care to children at all. But it's also the case that this underlying parental care system can be kind of triggered in certain situations more so than others. So in that way too, it's analogous to the behavioral immune system. So for example, if you're walking down the street and you see somebody, let's say you see somebody with an adorable puppy, just seeing that puppy is going to make you go, oh my God, that's so cute. And that response is kind of essentially, it's triggering this parental care system. So seeing that puppy kind of activates the emotions and the cognitions associated with parental caregiving, which can then have further consequences for how you respond to something else. Yeah. In fact, then there's research, for instance, that shows that if people have just seen pictures of adorable kittens and puppies, they're just more careful in their own behaviors. It's kind of, not in this sense, they're not caretaking for somebody else. They're just being more careful and less impulsive. There's work that shows, actually a student of mine did some work that showed that if people had just been looking at pictures of adorable puppies who seem to be lost or otherwise need care, that leads them in turn to be less sexually aroused by people that they might otherwise be sexually aroused by. The idea in this case is you're activating this kind of parental caregiving system. It kind of depresses a little bit some of the mating motives that might otherwise come online.
So it sounds like it must be evolutionary ancient if it can apply not only to human babies but to these other cute little animals.
Yeah, well, and I think or at least parts of it are, I'm guessing, are pretty evolutionary ancient. So that is, again, people are responding not to kind of a rational appraisal of the situation. We're responding to cues. And, I see an adorable, cute little puppy that's got some of the same kind of cues that my own adorable baby child might have. The big eyes, the round cheeks, the smushed snout. So people are responding in this kind of highly automatized way to these cues, and their their emotions and other kind of caregiving cognitions are being tricked accordingly. There is, you raised the question about how evolutionary ancient this is, and I think it's here's an interesting question, I think, which really has to do with, well, let me pose the question a different way. Is there really a parental caregiving system, or might it actually be kind of multiple systems? So, and I bring this up because, earlier when I was saying that there's these different aspects to parental caregiving motives, there's kind of a, protect this thing from harm element to it. But there's also this kind of more nurturant thing. It's like, in addition to protecting this thing from harm, I need to kind of provide nurturant care for it so that it can not just survive, but thrive. And I suspect that there actually may be these different mechanisms involved, some of which are more evolutionarily ancient. So the protection aspect of it, I suspect, is kind of a generalization of these kind of self-protective machinery we have in ourselves. It's easy enough to expand that and just say, all right, not only do I want to protect myself from harm, I want to protect this other thing from harm as well. So that's drawing upon some very evolutionary ancient stuff.
Yeah.
But I suspect that some of these more nurturant elements, the things that are leading people not just to help this thing survive, but to thrive, might be more recent in their evolutionary origin, and emerged in conjunction with the evolution of the life history of human beings. As we became more and more slow to, as our ancestors became more and more slow to develop, there was more and more benefit to doing things to actually help offspring be good learners, for instance, and to figure out how to solve the many problems that people have to solve in their social world in order to not just to survive, but to thrive, and ultimately to make friends, to find mates, to be good parents themselves if they end up producing children.
Yeah, it's very interesting, this mama bear paradox that you mentioned, where as the care goes up, the protective instinct and maybe aggression for the sake of protection goes up as well.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is actually very fascinating about this parental care system is that it does lead people not just to be caring, but there's research that folks have done, not me, but other folks that have shown that it can lead to more aggressive responses, just like your mama bear thing. So that part of the essence of parental care is aggressing against folks who might pose some sort of threat.
Yeah, well, I look forward to reading more about this as this line of work continues.
I look forward to producing something for you to read.
All right, Mark, thank you very much for your time.
Sure. Hey, it's been fun.
Yeah.